ones who actually sort of do it, right? I consult. And even though this is being recorded, I'll say, being a consultant for the Archdiocese doesn't pay as well as being a consultant for a weapons manufacturer. But you can sleep at night, so it's a trade-off. So the curriculum we have coming this coming year, need more mic? I'll just hold it.
Just hide it.
I'll just hold it. I'll just hold it. The curriculum that's coming up this coming year is going to be on 2 books this time, and there's also going to be more lessons available. It's going to be on the Gospel according to St. Luke and on the Acts of the Apostles. And if you're going to use all of it fully, then the idea is you would use St. Luke's Gospel in the fall and the book of Acts in the spring. As we're going to see as I sort of talk us through it, one of the good things about, see, on one hand you may be looking at it going, that's a ton of material, right? That's like 54 chapters worth of Bible, right? Last year we had the book of Romans, which is 16 chapters for the whole year, right? So it may seem like, well, you're not going to be able to go into detail. That is true, and you should be glad today, because if you've ever listened to the whole counsel of God, you know how long it would take me to go through the book of Luke and Acts. I'm not going to keep you here for 3 weeks. So, but the benefit in terms of curriculum is that there is an intent at a certain point that this is going to become a cycle, right? So that kids will have, right, the Gospel of Luke and the book of Acts when they're 3, and then maybe again when they're 9, and then maybe again when they're 15, right? And so this means, because there's this volume of material, we can sort of draw out of these sort of chunks that we're going to talk about of material to make things that are appropriate for different age groups. So there are certain discussions, obviously, like some of the things in Acts where you're talking about sexual immorality. I'm not going to talk about that with the kindergartners, right? But there's other material in that section of Acts that you can. Then when you get older kids, teenagers who are asking questions about that, then you can dig into those parts. There's also, particularly in St. Luke's Gospel, there are portions, or this is something that's true of the Gospels in general, there are portions that are just sort of evergreen, right? Where a person who's miserable and depressed and pulls the Gideon Bible out of their hotel drawer, right, can get something out of reading it. Christ's parables, for example. And, you know, a monk on Mount Athos who's 80 years old and has been there his entire adult life can read the same parable and get something out of it. And so that means curriculum-wise, there's something a 5-year-old can learn from it. There's something an 18-year-old can learn from it. There's something the instructor can learn from it, right? And so those can keep getting revisited over and over again. So even though it seems like a lot of material, there's a certain strategy to that, right? In terms of being able to do lessons and doing them on an ongoing basis. The reason particularly St. Luke's Gospel and the Acts of the Apostles are together, some of you may know this already, but it's really a 2-volume work. Right? Acts is, we may know they're both by St. Luke, but Acts is not like a sequel. Right? It's not like St. Luke got done, the Gospel of Luke was really popular, hey, let's go back to the well, right, and write the next part, right? This is a 2-volume work. It's more like Dune, right, than it is like The Hangover, right? So this is an intentional, right? This is, from St. Luke's perspective, this is one story, right? This is one story told across 2 volumes. And that's very important because that might not be intuitive to us when we're reading the book of Acts. But St. Luke is going to go to great pains to try to show us that everything that's happening in Acts, whether we're talking about the early church in Jerusalem, we're talking about the first deacons, we're talking about St. Peter's early ministry, or St. Paul's missionary journeys, he sees all of those as a continuation of the story that begins with the birth of St. John the Forerunner and then the birth of Christ. Right? This is for him one arc. Right? It's told in 2 chapters. And so it makes sense to structure a curriculum this way, to put them together for this reason. Right? To try to draw some of that out. Especially for older kids who can start seeing some of those patterns that get established in the Gospel of St. Luke and then get repeated as we move into the book of Acts and start to make those connections. In my experience, teaching mostly to adults, but also sometimes to high schoolers and going through the Bible, the thing that most excites people is when they start making connections, especially when they make them themselves. We can just kind of guide them to it. And then they have that moment of discovery, right, where they sort of go, oh, right, and it connects. That can make for a very powerful learning experience. So the more of those you can guide people to, whether it's connections within the Bible stories we're talking about, whether it's connections between what we're reading in the Bible and something in the liturgy, or something in one of the hymns, or one of the feasts, right, those moments of discovery are sort of really, really powerful. So, St. Luke, we don't know an awful lot about. The scriptures have little bits of information, and then we have some more information in our tradition. But even that is not sort of fully fleshed out, where we know like his whole life story, and exactly who his parents were, and these sort of things, where we construct a biography of them. Traditionally, so this is not, well, I'll start with what's in the scriptures. What we have in the scriptures is, we have the tradition that St. Luke wrote St. Luke's gospel because his name is on it, right? And then that Luke who wrote that gospel, and then by virtue of that Acts, it's a 2-volume work, is the same Luke who St. Paul refers to at the end of Colossians as St. Luke the Blessed Physician, who is his friend and companion. That dovetails nicely with the fact that partway through the missionary journeys of St. Paul in the book of Acts, all of a sudden the book of Acts switches from saying they, like Paul and his companions went here, went there, went to the other place, to we went here, went there, and to the other place, right? That this is written by a companion of St. Paul. That's pretty much it that you could get directly from the scriptures. Now, traditionally, we have some more identifiers. One of the most important ones is that at the end of St. Luke's gospel, when Christ accompanies the 2 disciples on the road to Emmaus, one of whom is identified as Cleopas, and the other one is just referred to as the other disciple, literally at one point the other guy, right, by St. Luke, that is actually St. Luke himself, and that he is sort of being humble by not identifying himself, by referring to himself in that way. And the reason that's a very important piece of tradition is that means that St. Luke was also a disciple of Jesus, not just someone who St. Paul met later. We also know traditionally that he was from Antioch. That works well with where the we's start in the book of Acts. And St. Paul identifies him as a physician, which means he was a highly educated person. Obviously, medicine was very different in the first century AD than it is now, right? But what that means is that his education was sort of broader based, right? Someone today could go and like do chemistry or biology in their undergrad and go straight into medical school. You know, they could get a medical degree without having read Shakespeare without having read Plato, right? That was not the case in the ancient world. To become a physician, you were educated in all kinds of things, right? This broad-based education, which also fits with another piece of our church tradition, which is that St. Luke was the first iconographer. So someone who was educated to be a physician in the first century would have been educated in one of the arts. They would have learned to play an instrument, they would have learned to compose poetry, they would have learned to paint, right? There would be some artistic component to that education. So again, that fits and makes sense. Right? That all sort of fits together and makes sense. We're not sure if St. Luke was Jewish. The other alternative, it's pretty clear he wasn't Greek. But the alternative is that he was basically a native Syrian. So he was a Semitic person, but not Jewish. Right, living in Antioch. That's possible. Right? And within the early disciples of Jesus, we have people who are Samaritans, Galileans, right, sort of other Semitic people in that group. So that's the other real sort of possibility in terms of his ethnicity. Another place where his education comes out is in how St. Luke's Gospel and the Book of Acts are written. They're written, St. Luke is very clearly trying to mimic the Greek style of, in particular, Thucydides, one of the classical Greek historians. So he is deliberately writing in a historical style. So someone in the first century who's fluent in Greek and picks up St. Luke's Gospel and Acts and reads it, they're going to immediately say, oh, okay, this is presenting itself as history. Right? It's presenting itself as history. This is important, right? It's not presenting itself as philosophy or philosophical treatise. It's not presenting itself as mythology. It's not presenting itself as a religious ritual text. It's presenting itself as history. That's how St. Luke is presenting it. Down to word choices and descriptions. There are also, this is kind of a nerd level point, but there are probably some nerds here other than me. But there are actually two versions of St. Luke's Gospel and the Book of Acts. And here's what's interesting about it. The contents are the same. But one is about 13% longer than the other. You say, how can you do that and have the contents be the same? Well, in the longer version, if in the shorter version, the Book of Acts says, a storm came upon the sea, then the longer version will say, a violent turbulence was thrown upon the sea. Right? So it's describing the exact same events, just sort of with more florid descriptors. Right? And that's usually referred to as Western Luke and Western Acts, for complex reasons that have nothing to do with East and West as we normally think about them. But, and people like me, who feel like they should publish journal articles and books about things, or they have to write a dissertation, have written endless things on how the two versions relate to each other, because we don't know. Both of them go back to at least the beginning of the 2nd century. So some people say St. Luke wrote both of them, but the longer one is sort of a second draft, right? Or a second revised edition by the same author. There's all kinds of theories. There are theories that the longer one comes first, and because you got to publish these journal articles, so you have to come up with a new theory. It's sort of boiled down, right, for simpler readers whose Greek wasn't as good. There's all kinds of different versions of that. But it's an interesting, like I said, it's a dirty but interesting tidbit to some of us. So the theme of St. Luke's Gospel may be kind of obvious. It's It's the life of Christ, right? It's the life of Jesus, who's presented as the Messiah. We'll go a little deeper than that, but just in the broad strokes. And the theme of the book of Acts might be less obvious, because the book of Acts doesn't even follow the same characters all the way through. It starts out talking about the 11 apostles. And then by the time you're, coming up on halfway through, they're pretty much gone, and it's just St. Paul from there out, right, has become the main character. And in between, there are other people who briefly, you have St. Philip going and doing things, briefly. You have St. Stephen's martyrdom. You have sort of other people taking it over. And so the movement is not one of following one character. It's not St. Paul's life story. Right? We catch up with Paul on the road to Damascus. We don't get much of his life story before that, actually, in the book of Acts. We get tidbits. Most of those tidbits come from things he says when he's preaching, right? That we say, oh, well, okay, so we don't have a unity of characters, right? So we have to look to a unity of theme, right? It's sort of the movement of where we go from the beginning to the end. And where we go from the beginning of the book of Acts to the end of the book of Acts, we start in Jerusalem and we end up in Rome. Right? And we have different people as we go through the book of Acts, carrying the gospel of Christ to these different places, starting in Jerusalem, then going to Samaria, to St. Philip, right, going to Antioch in Syria, and then eventually St. Paul in chains, right, takes the gospel to Rome. So that is sort of the overarching theme. Right, is the journey of the gospel from Jerusalem to Rome. And there is assumed in that, because it is also, from St. Luke's perspective, the journey of Christ from Jerusalem to Rome. For St. Luke, Christ himself and the gospel are almost synonymous. Because when Christ starts preaching in St. Luke's gospel, St. Luke's going to say he's going around preaching the gospel. Well, he can't be preaching the contents of the gospel of St. Luke because a lot of that hasn't happened yet. Right, when he first starts preaching in Galilee. This is because for St. Luke, the gospel is fundamentally who Christ is. First and foremost, that Jesus is the Messiah, Jesus is the Christ, who Christ is. And then relatedly, because this is kind of inseparable, who he is and then what he does. That's why the first volume can be called the gospel. Because it's the story of who Jesus is and what he does. And then who Jesus is and what he does is what ultimately goes to Rome. Something we overlook a lot in the book of Acts is that Christ doesn't appear to St. Paul just once on the road to Damascus. He appears to him in person 2 other times. The last time just before he goes to Rome. Right, to tell him he's going to Rome. So as St. Paul is traveling, Christ is traveling with him, St. Luke wants us to understand. So the pattern of Judea and then Samaria and then the ends of the earth, that's what plays out over these two volumes. St. Luke also tells us at the beginning of his gospel that he's not writing the first one and that he's seen and read the other ones. He says, many people have set out to write about Christ, to write about the things that happened in Jerusalem. And he indicates that he did research. So he isn't presenting it as the way St. Mark does or St. John does. He's not presenting it as, I have an eyewitness account. He's presenting it as, I talked to eyewitnesses. I talked to people who were there. I talked to the people who saw these things. And sometimes he will just name drop in the gospel seemingly random people. He'll just say, this was so-and-so who was so-and-so's son. You're like, well, what does that have to do with anything? Right? Well, at the time it was written, those were people who were in the church. Those were people who people knew. So he's kind of citing his sources. Right? He's kind of, so-and-so was there. He's kind of tipping you off. This is who I talked to. Right? So-and-so was there. He told me. Right? What happened? So-and-so there. She told me that this is what happened. And piecing things together, he kind of tips us off that he got a lot of the first part of his gospel from the Theotokos. That bit about Mary treasured up all these things in her heart, or Mary remembered all these things, that's him tipping you off that he spoke to her. Right? That's where he's getting this. He's not just imagining what might have happened, right? But he's got a source, right? Which also fits again with our church tradition that one of those first icons that St. Luke painted was of the Theotokos. He may have talked to her while he was painting her portrait. Right. So, one of the things with St. Luke's Gospel, this plays into both Luke and Acts. This is one of the reasons why people think he may not have been Jewish himself, is that St. Luke's Gospel, when you compare it to the other three Gospels, is probably the quote-unquote least Jewish. Right? That's not to say that means he wasn't Jewish, right? But a lot of the other Gospels will just refer to these Jewish traditions. Right? So it was the days of unleavened bread. It just sort of assumes that the reader knows what that is. Okay? St. Luke does a lot less of that. And when he does refer to something like that, he'll give an explanation. He'll say, you know, he went, this feast was going, which is a great feast, right, among Jewish people. He'll kind of give explanatory notes when he does do that. Now, I think ultimately that kind of thing is irrelevant to whether or not St. Luke is Jewish. I think it has more to do with his audience, right? The people he was writing to. And that's, again, if he's writing in a style that's deliberately aping sort of Greek historical style, that means he's writing for people who he would expect to pick up on that. There weren't a ton of people in Judea who were educated in Greek letters, right? They may speak some Greek, especially in Galilee, but they weren't sitting around reading Plato in Jerusalem, right? For the most part. They weren't performing Greek tragedies in Greek. They weren't, right? These are things that a Greek audience, a Greek-speaking, native Greek-speaking audience would pick up on, right? People who had a Greek education. And again, if he's a companion of St. Paul, right? Who is St. Paul primarily writing to, preaching to, traveling to visit, right? Non-Jewish Christians, right? Non-Jewish Christians. And so he's crafted his presentation of who Christ is and what he's done, and the story of him going ultimately to Rome, the capital of the world at the time, in such a way that they will understand it, they will be able to connect with it, right? Because Christ is the Jewish Messiah, but he's not just like the Messiah of the Jews and that's it, right? As St. Paul says at one point in Romans, is God the God only of the Jews, right? Expecting even the Jewish people to be like, well, no. Right? He's God. Right? But so St. Luke is deliberately crafting that. So, time is short. I'll get into the actual text. So at the beginning of St. Luke's Gospel, the first two chapters, which is the first sort of chunk we take in terms of the lesson plans, St. Luke puts a number of things sort of in play, sort of thematically. Luke 2 may be the most famous long passage of Scripture. I mean, John 3:16 is the most famous verse because people watch sports. But Luke 2 is probably the most famous long passage because Linus reads it to us every Christmas. And that, of course, is about the birth of Christ. I have real trouble when I have to read it liturgically because as a kid I memorized the King James Version. So I keep tripping over the RSV that's in the Archdiocese Gospel book because it's slightly different. I keep wanting to say that the shepherds were sore afraid, for example. But in addition to telling about the birth of St. John the Forerunner and telling about the birth of Jesus, there are a number of interesting dynamics that St. Luke kind of sets up that we might not notice. Because even though I said it's probably the least Jewish in the sense that we talked about, that doesn't mean that St. Luke isn't interested in the Old Testament. He's mostly interested in the Greek Old Testament, but the Greek Old Testament was out there in the world available to Jewish and non-Jewish Christians. And this is what they were reading from in their gatherings, right? The New Testament's still being written. So they weren't having gospel and epistle readings yet at the time St. Luke is writing his gospel, right? They're hearing these readings from the Old Testament. And so he is very deliberately, like the other gospel authors and like St. Paul in his letters, trying to help them make connections between the Old Testament scriptures that they're hearing read and Christ and the gospel and their life as a church community. One of those is the way in which St. John the Forerunner is utilized in St. Luke's Gospel. All of the Gospels, we've lost, even though, fortunately, because of our Orthodox tradition, he's still very prominent in our churches. St. John the Forerunner's icon is on pretty much all of our iconostases in a very prominent place. In our thoughts about right, the Gospel, we've lost, I think, not as much as some of our non-Orthodox Christian friends, we've lost some of the significance of St. John. How significant St. John is in all of the Gospels, right? And each of the Gospels sort of talks about him in a kind of unique way. But St. Luke's Gospel, he's the one who tells about his birth. He's the one who tells us about his father being a priest. So we have this person, St. John the Forerunner, out in the wilderness, who rightfully should be a priest, right? If not the high priest. We have the Theotokos, whose name in Greek is Miriam, and then we have Christ. And so for people who are hearing the Torah read, right, the Pentateuch, read in Greek every Saturday, through most of it, through most of the Pentateuch, through most of the Torah, you've got Moses, his sister Miriam, and his brother, really sort of cousin, Aaron, who becomes the high priest. Right. So, St. Luke, right at the beginning of his gospel, kind of sets up this dynamic. Now for him, each of those is sort of greater than the fulfillment, right, of the Old Testament predecessor. But he's making a pattern, right, and connecting those two things. Probably liturgically, obviously the Luke 2 and Christ's birth is the most prominent thing in the first two chapters. Right? And this is another one of those sort of evergreen things, right? Where younger children can learn just the story of Jesus' birth, right? And then obviously you can go much deeper into the idea of the incarnation, of God becoming man, as kids get older. Our second sort of chunk is chapters 3 through 5. The very prominent story there, obviously in our liturgical life, is Christ's baptism, which is sort of the culmination of the story of St. John. Theophany hopefully has a prominent place in our liturgical life. In terms of the church, it's a much bigger feast than Christmas, but we live in America, so what are you going to do? But obviously that's going to be the focus, I think, of most of the lesson plans. Sort of on that chunk is going to be on Christ's baptism. The next sort of chunk is chapters 6 through 8, which is in St. Luke's Gospel. Chapter 6 through 8 are what's commonly called the Sermon on the Plain. It's called that because a lot of the content is parallel, not identical, but parallel to what Christ preaches in the Sermon on the Mount in St. Matthew's Gospel. But that one starts with Christ sitting down on a mountain, so it's called the Sermon on the Mount. And this one starts with Christ looking out over the people on the plain, so it's the Sermon on the Plain. Plain. He's not that annoying person you get seated next to who wants to tell you their political views on the airplane. I have a strategy for that, by the way. Bring a math textbook with you on a plane and act like you're reading it, because then when that guy asks you what you're reading and you show him, he won't talk to you. So we need to understand when we're reading sermons in the New Testament, whether we're talking about the Gospels or we're talking about St. Paul's sermons and other apostles' sermons that we read in the book of Acts, that these are summaries. Right? There was no one sitting there taking down word for word, right? Everything that somebody said. So this is, especially when we're dealing with St. Luke and we're dealing with his gospel where he says he does research, right? So he's talking to lots of people. And so he may have had one person say, I remember very clearly this story Jesus told, this parable, right? Okay, write that down, right? I remember he said this. I remember someone asked him about this and this is what he said, right? And he's putting those together in this homily. And it's very apparent, like the Gospels are not trying to pretend that these are word for word. Like if you look at the Sermon on the Mount in St. Matthew's Gospel, you could do this. You could go read it out loud, right? Go read it out loud. It takes like 45 minutes to read it out loud. But when you read St. Matthew's Gospel, Christ starts preaching at midday and then like the sun's going down at the end, right? So it's very clear. The Gospels are telling you this is a summary. They're not pretending it's not, right? So these are key points. These are important stories that people remembered. As I said, it's content that's parallel to but not identical to the Sermon on the Mount. So for example, it starts off in St. Luke's Gospel with something like the Beatitudes, right? But it's not the same list of things. And St. Luke not only has blessed are you, right, with a list of things, but then he has woe to you. And woe to you is not a good translation. But if I did a good translation, this video would get demonetized on YouTube later. Woe to you is a severe thing, right? We can think of it, it's almost, right, like if someone got angry at you and they shook their fist at you and said, woe to you, you'd probably laugh, right? But in the context, this is just shy of cursing. Right? Because it actually is cursing in the literal sense, right? This is saying like, you're accursed, right? If this applies to you, you're in a bad spot, right? So this is we think when someone is being woe is me, that they're just sitting around kind of whining and being emo and right? They're a teenager, right? Like, But woe is me is like what Isaiah yells when he comes into the presence of God and realizes what a sinner he is and thinks he's going to get obliterated, right? And he starts tearing his clothes and yelling, woe is me, right? This is a severe thing, right? And so St. Luke not only says, blessed are the poor, he says, woe to you who are rich. Right? He not only says, blessed are the humble, he says, woe to you who are right? He's got sort of both sides of it. And this obviously could be a conversation point, right? We need to, especially with older kids, we need to nuance people's view of Jesus. Right? Like, I feel sometimes when I read, especially the one gospel reading in Holy Week, where Jesus is just letting loose on the Pharisees. Right? Calling them, brood of vipers. You cross heaven and earth to make one convert, you make him twice the son of hell that you are, right? I feel like there's probably somebody out listening to it going, wow, Jesus is being really un-Christ-like. He's being really mean. He's not acting like Jesus. Oh wait, that is Jesus. We've been sold this idea that Jesus was sort of this milquetoast. And he just went around telling everybody, no, you're okay, just the way you are, you're special. Right? That's not the Jesus we meet in any of the Gospels. Right, in any of the Gospels. Now, he's not going around, even with the Pharisees, right, or here with these woes, he's not doing this to belittle people, mock people, right? He's not just saying, you're horrible people, because he's still talking to them. Right? He's still talking. If he didn't care, he wouldn't say anything. You leave them alone and let them suffer their fate. Right? He's telling these folks they're in trouble. He's telling these folks where they're headed. Right? The hope being that they won't finish the journey, right? That they'll turn around, that they'll come back. Right? And so in addition to nuancing our view of Jesus, this gives us an opportunity to say, right? What does it mean when the scriptures or the church or our spiritual father or someone close to us says, man, you're sinning, you're messing up. What you're doing is wrong. That doesn't mean they're a hater. That doesn't mean they have all this negativity that you need to get out of your life. Right? The reality is that means that they care about you, right? They love you. They see where you're headed and they're trying to help you not finish that journey, right? Before it's too late. And they are being Christ-like when they do that. Even if to get it through your thick head, they have to kind of let you have it. I get to that point often. You ask Satan, let me have it. I probably needed more of it than he let me have. But. Okay, so next section is chapters 9 through 11 in St. Luke's Gospel. And there's sort of a shift that happens in those chapters. So before that, especially as exemplified by the Sermon on the Plain, Christ is going around and preaching in Galilee, in the north, up above Judea. Which is where he's from. And then during these chapters, Christ starts talking to his disciples and saying, okay, we're going to Jerusalem. And he doesn't just say, okay, we're taking a trip, now we're going to go preach the same thing in Jerusalem. He tells them he's going to Jerusalem to die. He tells them exactly what's going to happen. Now we know they kind of don't believe him, right? They try to argue with him, especially St. Peter. No, we never let that happen. And then Jesus will say, well, no, this is what's going to happen. He says, well, then I'll die with you. Sure. Right. But, right, but this is where that shift happens. Right? And That shift is important for a few reasons, right? It's important that we remember that everything that happens to Christ is not a victim, right? He isn't a person who had these horrible things happen to him. This is deliberate. He's on a mission. He knows what that mission entails, right? This is what he's come to do, and he's doing it, right? He's doing it voluntarily for our sake, out of love. It's also important that we see the disciples not understanding. Right? They don't understand, they're confused, they only understand after the fact. Right? Because this is where most of us are at with God most of the time. At least I'll speak for myself. Right? You can look back at things in your life and be like, right? I see what God was doing. Right? I see now why that happened. Oh man, I really wanted to do that. That would have been a disaster. Right? But at the time, we're very often, what? No, this is, right? And we pray and pray for something else, right? That we realize much later we didn't actually want, right? So it's important that the disciples here are very human, right? And very much like us. Christ knows exactly what's happening and what's going on. And they're primarily being called upon to trust him. Right? Even though they don't understand at the moment. They mostly fail to do that. Right? They very much have the idea that we have that, okay, well, explain it all to me. And then when it all makes sense to me, then I'll trust you. Right? Which isn't trust at that point. It's agreement. Right? Right? And it's the exact opposite. We have to trust first. And when we trust and we're faithful first, then later on, we get it. And we understand. Okay. Next little chunk is chapters 12 through 13. This is another section of Christ's teaching, but it's not primarily parables. There are a couple parables in there, but it's primarily more sort of direct teaching. This is where we get into the asking, how many times do I have to forgive my brother? 7 times. Then the 8th time I can let him have it? No, right? A number of those teachings that Christ gives there are ones where his disciples then say, oh, this is a hard teaching. Oh, that's not the answer we wanted. Right? And that has its own importance, right? About learning to ask honest questions and accept the answers. Right? There are a lot of dishonest questions in that. So I'm Dutch, right? And if you didn't notice. But Dutch people are kind of renowned for being very blunt. That's the polite way to say rude. And so I've asked my mom about this with my dad, right? My mom had to kind of adjust to it. Because when my mom said, do I look good in this dress? My dad treated that like an honest question. Right? No. And would tell her every time, right? Would say no, or would say, no, you look better in this other one. You should wear that instead, right? And that obviously caused some problems the first several dozen times, right? But eventually in their marriage, she actually came to value that, right? That he wouldn't just tell her what he thought she wanted to hear, that he'd actually be honest. And so we tend to be like that. We don't immediately value honest answers sometimes, right? We want to be told everything's okay, or we want to be told that, no, you're doing it just right. Everything you're doing is perfect and great, right? But that's often not the truth. And the truth, even if it's hard, right, is better. It's better for Next section is chapters 14 through 16. And this section has a lot of parables again. And as I said, this is one of those things that gives a lot of freedom, right? In that different parables can kind of connect with different kids of different ages, right, on different topics. Even though it's not in this section, right? It's in the Sermon on the Plain, where Christ tells the parable of the Good Samaritan. The Good Samaritan is a good example of a parallel that has a whole bunch of levels to it, right? Because there's the very basic level of, right, love your neighbor, right? You see someone in need, you should help them, right? Anybody of any age can understand that. You see someone sad, you see someone upset, you see someone who needs help, go and help them, right? And most of us adults need to hear that all the time, just as much as little kids do. But there are all kinds of layers to it. So here's a much deeper layer, right? We're told that the first two people who walk past are a priest and a Levite, right? Who sort of ignore the person who's beaten and bleeding and robbed. They walk by on the other side of the road, we're told. Why would they walk by on the other side of the road? Well, because they're a priest and a Levite. So they have to maintain their ceremonial cleanness so that they can go and serve in the temple. So not only are they not helping this person, if you asked them, like if you confronted them, if a news reporter ran up to them right after they walked past, why'd you walk past that guy? Right? Why didn't you help him? Right? That would have been their answer. They said, I'm a priest, I serve in the temple. He's bleeding, I'd be unclean. Then I couldn't serve. So they'd have this very pious sounding excuse as to why they couldn't help this person. Right? The Samaritan who comes by is already unclean, de facto. He's a Samaritan. Right? He's a Samaritan. And so not only is it less likely that a Samaritan would help a Jewish person, but he's also not risking anything. Right? He's not risking anything. And so at a deeper level, you can talk about, right, the fact that the reason a lot of times we don't want to get involved in somebody's life or somebody's problems or the difficulties they're having is that we kind of want to stay clean. I don't want to get involved in all that mess. I don't want anything to do with that. Right? They made a bunch of bad choices and I didn't. Right? I'm kind of proud of that. And right? Maybe bad, this is what happened. But that's not the picture we see here. That's not the picture we see here. And this is not something brand new that Jesus is bringing up. This is there already in the Torah and in the Old Testament. Here's a place where it is. One of the greatest good deeds you can do in the Old Testament is go and bury someone whose body was left unburied, whose body was abandoned, and you go and bury it. It's one of the greatest deeds you can do. And the reason why it's considered one of the greatest good deeds you can do is that you have to touch a dead body to do it. You have to make yourself unclean. Right? You have to take risks in order to do it. You're going to be doing it at your own expense. You're going to be doing it, right? So this is Christ pointing this out. And so the question that occasions the parable of the Good Samaritan is, of course, who is my neighbor? Because I want to limit that as much as possible. Right? I want to limit who I have to love and how I have to love them, so it's a bar I can step over easily. Right? I don't even have to jump. Right? And Christ is saying, ultimately, that you have to love a random stranger enough to do the greatest good deed you could do for them. This is the escalation. So he raises that bar right back up as high as it can get. Right, in terms of everybody. And so that's just an example, even though it's not from that section. That's an example of how you can go much deeper into a parable with an older group. Or if you choose to use these lessons some version of these lessons in an adult Sunday school. You could do that. So the next section is chapters 17 through 21. That's the first part of that is sort of the conclusion of Christ making his way to Jerusalem. The last miracles he works are in there. And then the second half of that section starts with the conflicts he gets into once he's in Jerusalem. Christ is in Jerusalem preaching in the temple courts, preaching to the people, and we get a lot of dishonest questions. Right? We get a lot of questions trying to trap people, or trying to trap him, people trying to trap him. Trying to get the people to turn on him, right? Trying to make him look bad, right? This opposition he faces. And there are, of course, levels you can go into on that, right? How does Christ respond to that? He doesn't respond to that by just vilifying those people, right? He's God. He could just start with, how dare you oppose me? And follow it up with the earth swallowing him up, right? But that's not who he is. Right? It's not that that's beyond his power. That's not who he is. Right? Christ over and over again answers dishonest questions as if they were honest questions. Right? And tells the people what they need to hear. And that's how he ends up getting around all the traps they set for him. And then chapters 22 and 23 are another section which describe Judas' betrayal of Christ and his crucifixion and death. Obviously, there's all kinds of levels to that. There's the basic story, right, of Christ's crucifixion and death. Older kids, you can talk about the figure of Judas. And adults, you can talk about the figure of Judas. One common thing, we hear hymns about Judas in Holy Week, read about Judas, he's just sort of this arch villain, right? He's sort of Shakespearean fiend, right? Who's just lurking there. Right? But the reason we sing about him and we read about him is not just to vilify this historical person who lived a long time ago and shake our fist at him and say how bad he was. The reason we talk about Judas is that I'm Judas. Right? Judas betrays Christ for 30 pieces of silver. Right? I betrayed him for a lot less than that. That's a lot of money in today's money. Right? I've betrayed Jesus for popularity, to avoid an awkward social situation. Right? I've shut up and not said something just to smooth things over, to get something I wanted out of somebody. Right? Every time we sin, frankly. But not just every time we sin, but every time we know, St. James says, the good we ought to do and we don't do it. We betray Christ to one extent or another. So the reason we talk about Judas is that he is the object lesson as opposed to St. Peter, who also denied and betrayed Christ. Judas is the example of the worst place we can go after that. St. Peter and Judas both deny and betray Christ. St. Peter repents with tears, and Judas goes and kills himself. And those are the two ways we can react to our own sin, our wickedness, when we realize what we've done. We can find repentance, right? Or we can fall into despair. We can turn away from Christ, leave the church, etc., etc., etc. Right? Which is death, according to the scriptures. Separating ourselves from Christ is death. More than physical death is death. And so that's an important It's an important way of reading. Right? St. Anthony the Great said that the wise man reads the scriptures as pertaining to himself and no one else. So the scriptures talk about Judas, or they talk about St. Peter denying Christ. Right? They're talking about me, not about somebody else. Not somebody historical, not my weird cousin, right? Not somebody I know and don't like, right? Me. And so then the last piece of St. Luke, chapter 24, the last chapter, is obviously Christ's resurrection, the resurrection appearances. If people go to Matins, which most people don't, if they do, this is the part they're most familiar with because they hear it in the cycle of Matins gospel readings on Sunday. But this includes the story of the road to Emmaus. And even here, St. Luke is doing some things for people who know history. I'll give you an example of in the road to Emmaus. This may be the only place you know Emmaus from, right? I imagine most people, other than Emmaus, Pennsylvania, where my confrere Father Andrew lives. And he won't stop telling you about it. Emmaus is actually significant in Jewish history. And you know this if you've read First Maccabees, which I know most people have not, right? Emmaus is the place where the big ultimate battle of the Maccabean Revolution happens. So the Greeks come in, they desecrate the Jewish temple. That triggers this revolt by the Jewish people. The Maccabee brothers, led by Judas Maccabeus. Maccabeus means the hammer. So his name is literally Judah the Hammer, which is about the coolest name ever. But so they lead this revolt, and the climactic battle happens at Emmaus, at the site of this village a few miles from Jerusalem. So when St. Luke just name drops Emmaus here, right? They're on the road that leads to Emmaus. That's like saying they're on the road to Gettysburg. We're in Pennsylvania. Brother Gettysburg, like this is right. This is historically significant. And then you look at what they say. They say to Jesus, not realizing it's Jesus, they tell him about Jesus. Right? They say, we thought he would be the one to restore the kingdom to Israel. Which is what the Maccabees did. Right? Meaning, we thought he was going to be the Messiah, he was going to come, he was going to overthrow the Romans. Right? And then what happens when they get close to Emmaus? It said that Jesus was going further. But they constrained him to stay. Right? So St. Luke there is very subtly commenting on sort of the messianic hopes of a lot of the Jewish people of the time, which were too small and didn't go far enough. Right? We just want to get rid of those Romans, those no good Romans. Right? What's ironic about that is that back with the Maccabean revolt, when they wanted to get rid of those no good Greeks, right? Part of how they did that is they made a treaty with the Romans. That's how the Romans got in there in the first place, was them trying to get rid of the no good Greeks. So if they had gotten rid of the no good Romans, it just would have been somebody else. But that's how they were thinking. Right? And so St. Luke is very subtly in the narrative by how he frames it, by what road he says it is. You know, it happens to be the one that leads to Emmaus. Commenting on that idea didn't go near far enough in terms of what Jesus was actually doing as the Messiah. Much bigger than that. Okay, so now shifting gears a little. Hopefully not destroying the clutch in the process. We shift over to the book of Acts. So we go to volume 2. Which gets introduced as volume 2. right at the beginning. Right? St. Luke says, in the former volume, O Theophilus. So there's some debate, because again, looks like we have to publish journal articles, either for their jobs or our egos. There are all kinds of theories back and forth as to, is Theophilus a guy? If so, which guy, right? Who is he? Or, since that name means the one who loves God, is it just a general, it was just addressing it to everyone who loves God? Not super pertinent, but again, you gotta publish journal articles. Arguing back and forth. So the first sort of lesson is really an intro to Acts. There are a number of things, just the fact that the book of Acts exists in the New Testament, I don't think we fully let sink in. Because the book of Acts is weird in the New Testament. Right? We've got 4 Gospels, okay, we kind of know what the Gospels are. And then we've got epistles. In our church, we've got a gospel book and an epistle book. The book of Acts is not technically a gospel and not an epistle. Right? It's in our epistle book. We read it as an epistle reading. But actually, technically, in Greek, that book is called the Apostolikon, meaning it's the book of the apostles, not the book of the apostles. But that's why Acts fits. But it's a narrative. It's the only narrative book of the New Testament that isn't about Jesus directly, like the Gospels are. Right? Now, the reason I say we haven't let this sink in is that I don't think we've pointed it out enough, especially to non-Orthodox Christians. Because there tends to be this view, and it's even a view among a lot of our people, that it's just sort of all about Jesus. Right? We just need to focus on that. Definitely don't need to worry about the Old Testament. That stuff we can all just throw in the bin now. But even the epistles sort of like, well, you know, that's Paul, right? And he's mean and says stuff I don't like. So. We'll just go with Jesus, because again, we think he's, hey, you know, like just loves everybody no matter what, and, right, and never corrects anyone, and all that, the way mean old St. Paul does. But this is after Christ's ascension into heaven. We read about the stories of the lives of a whole bunch of people who aren't Jesus. And that's Scripture. And as we said, that's presented by St. Luke as the continuation of the story of Christ. His life continues in the life of his apostles and the life of his people. This says something very important about the lives of the saints. Right? And the value of the lives of the saints. Reading them, keeping that memory alive. It says something very important about the history of the church. The history of the church is not just interesting, nerdy facts about things that happened a long time ago. But from St. Luke's perspective, the way he writes, the history of the church is the continuation of the story of Christ. It's what Christ is doing in the world. So just the book of Acts, being in the New Testament, has a lot of importance to it. Right? And in terms of lessons, I think it's very important that we come to understand that what we do when we live as Christians in the world, and what we do as a church community and church body, likewise, from the perspective of the Scriptures, is the continuation of the life and work of Christ in the world. Right? That what we do, even though it seems silly, because we spend an hour arguing about what kind of rice to serve at the parish dinner. And if you're in certain parts of this country, that could split your church. Sandra knows what I'm talking about. Right? And we think, oh, this is all kind of silly. This is all kind of, you know, we're putting some money in the offering plate, or these, right? We don't have the big picture right in front of us. right? That each of us and all of us together as a community are writing another piece of a chapter in this story, right? And that each of us is called to be a saint. Each of us is called to live a life that future generations of Christians will look back to and remember. And be inspired by, in their own generation, to live as Christians and write their own next chapters, right, of this story. And that can be a very powerful framing to a lot of tedious meetings, right? And administrative stuff, and just difficult stuff we're getting tired of, right? Is realizing the level of importance that these things really have, that we can't always see at the moment. Right? I mean, St. Paul, when he's sitting in prison for this 15th time, after getting thrown out of the 27th town, right? We don't have an appreciation because he, of course, we now remember as St. Paul as to what a failure he looked like most of his life from the standards of the world. Like every church he planted that didn't get split by some wandering heretic, like he's having to write them letters about horrible sexual immorality they're practicing, right? Just all kinds of stuff going on. He's having to write to them continuously over and over and over again. Right? Like, if one of our parishes had half the problems that his parish did, right? You'd have a bishop like moving in, like to try to figure out what was going on, right? Because of the mess, right? That was right. So this wasn't like St. Paul was walking around planting these huge, vibrant churches, right? That were growing like crazy, and they all loved him, and he, you know, that's not what his life was like, right? So he did not have in his immediate experience any kind of success, or, you know, me and St. Peter someday are going to be the pillars of the whole church all over the globe. Like, he did not have immediate evidence of that, right? He was trying to get through the night. By the end of his life, he probably barely moved the number of times he's been beaten, stoned, whipped, right? Tried to fall asleep at the bottom of a cistern in Rome, right? Like, that was his day to day, right? But we now see the big picture. And so when we're going through smaller, at least with me, much smaller trials, you know, that we act like are just as big, that perspective can be very powerful for us. So the next section of Acts is chapters 1 and 2. That leads up to Pentecost. And this, you know, younger kids, this can start out real easy, you know, learning the Troparion of Pentecost, and, right, what happened with the coming of the Holy Spirit. You can go much deeper. You can bring in the Old Testament readings from Vespers, whether they went to Vespers or not, right? So one of those, for example, is from the book of Numbers, where the Spirit, the Holy Spirit, right, the Spirit of God who's resting on Moses, is taken and separated and given to all of the elders of the people in the camp, and they all start prophesying. Right? And someone comes to Moses and is like, hey man, you need to tell them to knock it off. They're cutting in on your territory, they're stealing your bit. Right? You're the one who's supposed to prophesy, not all these people. And Moses says, no, I wish that all of God's people would receive the Spirit. Right? And be able to prophesy. Right? So church understands Pentecost as, right, Moses' wish finally coming true. And so, again, making those connections between the Old and New Testaments can be a very powerful thing. Next section is chapters 3 through 8. And this is mostly, well, it starts out with the 11. It starts out with the apostles, and we start to see a pattern. One of the things St. Luke does, as we mentioned, to try and show how this is a continuation of the story of Jesus, is show these patterns repeating. So the apostles work miracles and they get hauled in front of the Sanhedrin and put on trial. All these things that Jesus did, they now do. And the people who oppose Jesus now oppose them. And the things that now start happening to them, including St. James gets executed by Herod, right? Not unlike St. John the Forerunner, right? These patterns sort of repeat themselves, right, in the early community. That then leads into the story of St. Stephen and his martyrdom. Most scholars agree now, so this is a scholarly perspective. I'm not even talking about church tradition now. Most scholars now agree that the first Christian feast, meaning the first feast that Christians started celebrating that wasn't previously a Jewish feast. So Pascha is the Greek word for Passover, right? So we still celebrate Pascha, we just celebrate something different at Pascha, right? So we're not counting that, right? We're not counting other Jewish feasts that were transformed, like Pentecost that was transformed, right, into a Christian feast. The first new independent Christian feast was St. Stephen's feast day on December 27th. And that's why his martyrdom is so prominent in the book of Acts. Because this had already become an observance. And there's a whole thing there of the understanding of martyrdom that developed in Judaism after the Maccabean period, where they had shrines where the relics of Jewish martyrs were. They made pilgrimages to them. They asked for their prayers, right? This was a Jewish thing before it was a Christian thing. But St. Stephen is sort of, that's why he's called the proto-martyr, right? He's sort of the first Christian martyr in that mold who's uniquely Christian, and so that becomes his feast day. This is another one of those arguments, if people try to give you the Christmas is pagan nonsense. We don't have a ton of time, but I feel the need to shoot on this very briefly. Right? Before the celebration of the Nativity of Christ happened, right, widespread in the church, we were already celebrating Theophany on January 6th. Right? That happened from the early 2nd century on. We were already celebrating the feast day of St. Stephen on December 27th. Right? We had 2 winter feast days already. We didn't need to make up a new one to cover a pagan holiday. That's dumb. Doesn't make sense. Right? So, that is not what happened. But anyway, okay, we don't have a lot of time. I will rant no further. But I will say, St. Stephen's story, again, when we're talking about patterns, right? Notice how when you compare Christ's death in St. Luke's Gospel, what's the last thing he says? Forgive them, don't know what they're doing. St. Stephen says the same thing, right? He's presenting as St. Stephen dies the way Christ died. This pattern continuing. That's actually also the first place where we see St. Paul stand there holding everybody's coats, cheering them on, being a hater. Yeah. So then the next lesson is chapter 9, the calling of St. Paul. I have a whole riff on why this isn't a conversion, but I did that last year when we were talking about Romans. I'm talking about the life of St. Paul. So there's a video of that on YouTube. So I'll save time now. Right? I'm not ripping on that. The core of it is St. Paul didn't convert from one religion to another because there wasn't this religion Judaism and this religion Christianity in AD 35. That's not real, right? So the way St. Paul always talks about it, both twice he talks about it in the book of Acts. St. Luke, of course, presents it happening here in this chapter in the book of Acts. St. Paul also talks about it in Galatians. All 4 times it's talked about, especially by St. Paul in Galatians, actually, when he does it firsthand. St. Paul talks about using language drawn from the calling of prophets in the Old Testament. Like he takes chunks from Jeremiah's call to be a prophet and just quotes them in Greek in Galatians. So he sees it as God called him to a particular prophetic ministry. He doesn't see it as, oh, I changed religions. Right. Now, he certainly went from not believing Jesus was the Messiah to believing Jesus is the Messiah. Right. Right. So it's not that he didn't change anything, right? But that was still a Jewish belief, right? Who the Messiah was. That didn't make you not Jewish.
What was your video called you just mentioned?
What's it called? The Romans video from last year.
Introducing the famous. It's just the introduction.
The
Remember?
recording that we did from
Yeah.
last year.
I can go
Remember
back
what it's
to
called?
it's in the
Yeah.
curriculum.
We do have it
Is it-
on,
yeah.
it's loaded on the page where you find all of the lessons.
Okay, it's linked, I guess.
Introducing Romans.
But I go into a ton more detail on that. I won't belabor it now due to lack of time. The next section, chapters 10 through 12, the primary story in that is about St. Peter going to visit Cornelius, the centurion. So Cornelius, the centurion, he's a Roman, obviously, he's unclean, right? On several counts. He's in the Roman military, which makes it worse. But we're told he's someone who fears and worships the God of Israel. He's someone who gives to the poor in Jerusalem. He's someone who supports the temple financially. He's someone who prays to the God of Israel. So he's sort of doing the best you can with what he has, right? And so what does God do? God sends St. Peter to give him more, right? To give him the gospel, to come present the Messiah to him, right? Now what's interesting is, of course, that he uses St. Peter to do this. Because God could have just sent the angel to Cornelius and had the angel tell Cornelius the gospel. Cut out the middleman, right? Instead he sends an angel to Cornelius, he sends an angel to St. Peter. St. Peter doesn't want to do it, he sends St. Peter a vision, right? Because there's something that needs to happen with St. Peter here. Right? Something needs to happen with St. Peter here. And that's that St. Peter needs to learn. Notice in the vision, he doesn't say, when he has the vision with the unclean animals, and God says, take and eat. He doesn't say to St. Peter, do as I say. But St. Peter says, no, I can't eat unclean animals. He says, don't call unclean what I have made clean. That God can make them clean. And so God is saying that he has made Cornelius clean. It's not that there's no uncleanness in the world. It's not like, hey, don't worry about all that Roman idolatry. No big deal, right? Don't worry about the Roman way of life and all the immorality, right? It's all good, right? He's saying, no, I've made him clean. You don't call him unclean. Right? You don't call him unclean. A lot of takeaways, right, from that. One important one, though, is that I deal with a lot of former Roman Catholics in southern Louisiana, but I think this is more widespread than just former Roman Catholics. A lot of people have a lot of difficulty accepting the fact that God has forgiven them. They don't really, there's some people who are a little too ready to believe that, but there are a lot of people who don't really accept it. I have to tell people over and over again, the last words I say to them in confession, having no further care for the sins which you have declared pardon and peace. Those are some of the most important words I say to them in the whole thing, in the whole process. Right? Because we don't leave and have no further care for those sins. We leave and they keep coming back to us and haunting us. Right? And we have trouble accepting, no, that's done. God actually forgave me from that. God actually made me clean. God actually, right? And even more so sometimes than ourselves, we have trouble believing that about other people. Right? With us, it may be the devil coming and poking at us, right, about old sins. But sometimes we're doing the devil's job with other people coming and pointing out, hey, remember, especially with family members. Remember when we were 12 and you, right? So not calling unclean what God has made clean is a important lesson for us to learn, same as with St. Peter. Next section is chapters 13 and 14, which is St. Paul's first missionary journey. Obvious things to talk about there at different levels is evangelism, right? And how a lot of us don't really feel the need to do it at all. Or, being nicer, a lot of us don't know how to do it if we wanted to, and therefore we're scared to do it. Right? What does that even look like? Do you want me to go knock on people's doors? Do you want me to harass people in the Walmart parking lot? Right? I mean, what do you want me to do? Right? What does that even look like? I'm supposed to travel to Troas? What? Right? So having conversations about that, especially with older kids, right? Like, what scares you about that? What do you think that would look like? The answer may be, I don't know. And so they're talking about, well, here's maybe what that might look like. Right? Here's how you could think about that. No, you don't have to accost people publicly and ask them where they'd go if they died tonight, right? That's not what we're talking about. Right? And different ways we could share the truth of Christ with people. The next section is on Acts chapter 15 and the Council of Jerusalem. All kinds of stuff there. We're talking about church councils and that kind of thing. One thing I'll focus on is the fact that that is horribly misread by most people, most humans. Right? The reading that a lot of people have of that is, we don't have to worry about the Old Testament anymore. That's the average person thinks that's where the church said, forget the Old Testament, which is the exact opposite. You actually read the letter St. James sends at the end. He says, Moses has been preached in every city, right? So it's not forget the Old Testament. And I won't name this person. I won't give any identifiers to this person, other than that it was a priest, an Orthodox priest. Was said to me, we don't have to worry at all about the law anymore. We just need to love God with all our heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love our neighbor as ourselves, which I said, that's Deuteronomy and Leviticus that you just quoted. But what actually happens in the Council of Jerusalem, there's these 4 rules that seem kind of weird. I mean, obviously sexual immorality being bad, okay, I get that, right? Worshiping idols being bad, totally get that. Eating meat with blood in it. How is that the same level? Right? And then eating blood. So 2 out of 4 are about eating blood, right? And then the other 2 are about idolatry and sexual immorality. That seems like a weird list. Like if you were going to come up with, here's the top 4 rules, right, that Christians need to follow. 2 of them would probably be on the list, but the other 2 not so much, right? Probably, for most of us. But I'll do the very short version of this because of time. If you go back to the book of Leviticus, right, which is everybody's favorite book of the Bible. People love it when you wave the fatty part above the kidneys in the air, like you just don't care. In the book of Leviticus, there's a section that runs from chapter 17 to about chapter 23. Some people argue chapter 24 because they have to publish a journal article. But somewhere in there, right? It's referred to as the holiness code because it's a whole series of commandments. And over again during it, God says, be holy as I am holy. Therefore, do this, don't do that. Right? All the way through. And in that section, most of the time, it's prefaced with, God said to Moses, go and tell the sons of Israel these commandments. There are 4 times through all those chapters, precisely 4 times, where it says, go tell all the sons of Israel and all of the strangers and foreigners who are dwelling in Israel these specific commandments. 4 times. One of them is Leviticus chapter 18, which is all the commandments about sexual immorality. One of them is about offering sacrifices to idols. And the other 2 or about eating blood. Allow me to suggest this is not a coincidence. Right? So the apostles, led by St. James, do the opposite, the exact opposite of saying, forget about the Torah. They say, let's take it really literally. There's a whole bunch of things, like keeping kosher, not eating bacon, right? Like I did this morning, that are directed to the Israelites, right? To Jewish people, for lack of a better word. And then there are these 4 that are directed to everybody, regardless. So St. James says, well, only those 4 apply to Gentiles living in Israelite communities, right? Only those 4 apply to Gentiles who become Christians. Because the other ones were for the Israelites, not for everybody. So this is the opposite. This may have bearing on our panel discussion later. What Acts 15 means about sexual immorality is not nebulous and vague. It's defined in Leviticus 18 in great detail. Right? And that's what St. Paul's referring to when he refers to sexual immorality. Right? This isn't just a floating signifier out here that we can redefine in every generation. It's listed out in detail in the book of Leviticus, exactly what is immoral. Right? If you want to know what that constitutes. Okay. Moving on for the sake of time. Chapters 16 through 18, then. It's another of St. Paul's missionary journeys. And we see a lot of, in these chapters, and I think this is what the curriculum is going to focus on, is a lot of the opposition to St. Paul. St. Paul was opposed from sort of 2 different directions. So a lot of the Jewish communities opposed him because he seemed to be drawing off followers after himself. Right? So a lot of the Gentiles, a lot of the non-Jewish people who became St. Paul's first non-Jewish Christians didn't come directly from paganism. There was this sort of middle state. There are people who are called God-fearers in the book of Acts, who are Gentiles who are kind of interested in Judaism. There's kind of a Judaism fad in the Roman Empire in the 1st century BC and the 1st century AD. I know that sounds weird. But General Pompey, before Caesar took him out, it was the one who annexed Judea to Rome. And when he did that, he went to Jerusalem, he went into the Jewish temple, and forced his way in and went into the Holy of Holies. He didn't die. But he went into the Holy of Holies, and when he got there behind the curtain, he saw there was nothing there, which blew his mind. Right? Because every temple he had ever seen, there was like a big idol. Right? There's a big statue of the god back in there. That's what he was expecting to see. And a bunch of treasures and gold, and he was probably planning to pillage it, right? And he thought that's why they didn't want him to go back there. So he goes back there, there's just this big empty space, because the Ark of the Covenant was already gone. There's nothing there, right? So he told the Romans this, he wrote about this. And so the Romans said, the Jews, they worship God sola mentis, only with their mind. Right? And this was sort of wild, right? To the Romans, they're like, oh, this is a very refined religion, very philosophical, right? They just worship with their mind. But so that created this fad. This got a lot of Romans sort of curious and interested in Judaism, right? There was a Greek translation of the Jewish scriptures around that they could get a hold of and read, and it seemed weird and fascinating to them, and they knew it was ancient, so that was kind of fascinating. And they would kind of be at the fringes of the synagogue. By that I mean they give money, right, to endow the synagogue, and they'd come around when they were allowed to, right, to sort of see what went on there, hear preaching and that kind of thing. So they're there at the fringes of the Jewish community, and a lot of those people, St. Paul was bringing into the Christian community, this other community, the followers of Jesus the Messiah. So there's some jealousy there. There's some maybe money being redirected there that might have caused an issue, right? There's rivalries, there's all kinds of things. And from the perspective of a lot of the Jews who didn't accept Jesus as the Messiah, St. Paul's some weird heretic, right? Coming here preaching this weird heresy, which St. Paul could kind of identify with because he was out killing Christians earlier because he thought they were weird heretics. So they're basically on the same page he used to be, right? So he has this opposition from a lot of the Jewish communities in these cities. He also had opposition from the actual pagans in a lot of these cities. Ephesus, in these chapters, is a good example of that. Temple of Artemis in Ephesus was one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. Huge pilgrimage site for the mysteries of Artemis. People would go there, right? Huge source of revenue for the city, between the pilgrimages and everything else, and making idols of ours for everybody to take home. And St. Paul shows up and starts getting all of these, not just Jewish people who already were into idolatry, but people who used to be into idolatry did not be into idolatry anymore. Right? And to say that that was a temple to a demon, they should destroy their idols, right? And all of these things. And they didn't take too kindly to that. Right? And it's literally in the text of Acts, it's the silversmiths guild. Right? The people making silver idols of Artemis for the pilgrimage people who instigate a sort of riot against St. Paul. We got to get this guy out of town. Right? He's cutting into our business. He's trying to destroy our ways. He's dishonoring our goddess. Right? So he's getting opposition sort of from all sides, right? In terms of what he's doing. And again, we tend to, if we go to do something and we face a ton of opposition, we tend to say, oh, well, maybe this isn't what I should be doing. Right? We're kind of put off by that. Right? I don't know about Siena, but I don't imagine that a lot of bishops, if a priest calls them and says, everyone here hates me and they're trying to run me out of town and they started throwing rocks at me yesterday. The bishop says, well, you're doing a great job. Keep up the good work. Right? Maybe Siena does that. I don't know. But probably, I think that doesn't happen a lot, right? But that was St. Paul's experience in city after city, town after town. Right? Literally getting run out of town. Literally having people stoned. Right? Getting lashes in synagogues. Right? Getting beaten by the Roman authorities, right? Over and over and over again. And so then, the last 3 sections of Acts are chapters 19 and 20. 19 and 20 kind of concludes St. Paul's 3rd missionary journey. The last few stops. Chapters 21 through 26 deal with his trials. He has a whole series of trials in front of a bunch of different Roman governors. These are all actual, the governors he sees in the book of Acts are actually historical people who we know about. Right? So there's one case with Festus where he's on trial, and it says Festus was hoping he would offer him a bribe. Right? And Festus was actually recalled to Rome and put on trial for bribery and extortion and a bunch of other crimes. So the picture we get of him in Acts is exactly the picture that history outside of the scriptures gives us of the same person. And there's a lot of confusion during the trials. The Roman governors especially, or pagans, do not understand what the argument is about. At one point, one of them has to write a letter and explain what's going on, and he says, I think there's this disagreement among the Jews. Some people say this person, Jesus, is alive, and some people say he isn't. Right? Like, that's his take. And they want to kill each other over it. I don't really understand, right? So there's a lot of that confusion. But what's important is how St. Paul approaches it. St. Paul, every time he gets called on to defend himself, he doesn't actually defend himself. He tries to evangelize whoever he's on trial in front of. He's like, cool, you just gave me an audience. Right? And he starts preaching the same way he preached in the synagogues and other places we've seen on our way through the book of Acts. To the point that the last member of the Herodian dynasty gets to hear him at one point, says, do you think you can convert me in such a short time? After St. Paul is done speaking, right? St. Paul's like, Give it a shot. So, right? And then the last section in the book of Acts, the 11th lesson is in chapter 27 and 28, which is St. Paul's journey to Rome. And this is St. Paul's endgame. It's been his endgame through the last several chapters. He's made public. He appeals to Caesar, and when he appeals to Caesar, the governor's like, why? Right? The governor's like, I would have let you go. Right? And they're saying, what? That's because St. Paul wants to go preach to Caesar. That's his whole endgame. He's like, this is how I can do it. Not easy to get an audience with Caesar when you're a Jewish guy. Right? Especially to try to talk about religion. Right? But now he's got it. As a Roman citizen, he has the right to do that. This could give him his opportunity to stand in front of Caesar. Right? This is important on a number of levels. One of them is that we have to remember who was emperor while St. Paul is doing these missions and saying he wants to go preach to Caesar. For most of his missionary journeys, it was Caligula. Okay? So, I won't go into detail about Caligula. You can read about Caligula for yourself. But if you think American politicians are bad, right? Like, but that, while Caligula's the emperor, St. Paul is praying for Caligula and wants to go preach the gospel to Caligula. At the time he actually makes this appeal against Rome, it's Nero, who was no peach himself. Right? But St. Paul sees not only is this guy not too far gone, because nobody for St. Paul is too far gone, but St. Paul is imagining what the consequences would be if the Roman emperor became a Christian. Right? How would that transform the world? We found out 300 years later, give or take. Right? But this was within St. Paul's vision of what could happen. Right? That the whole world could be transformed. Despite everything he'd suffered, despite how beaten he was, he's in his 60s at this point, beaten up, battered, right? Faced all this opposition, faced all this rejection. He still thinks, if I can just get in front of Caesar, right, and preach to him, and he became a Christian, the whole world could change. And I think that's a good place to cap this off because, again, we tend to think, right, I'm just a person, right? We look at American politics, we know how the Electoral College works, right? We realize by now, I think, that our individual vote doesn't count. If we're adults, right? We get jaded about all this stuff, right? Different people get elected, nobody fixes my road, right? Like, that's, nothing much changes except things get worse, right? And we don't have this vision that St. Paul had, living in a much darker time with much more horrific rulers, right? Where every city he went to was dominated by the worship of demons and gross sexual immorality, right? And he thinks we can change all this, we can transform all this just by living as Christians in this city. By loving our neighbor, by loving each other, by loving God, we can transform all of this. And it took a while, right? And he didn't live on this earth to see it. I think he got to see it, but not on this earth, he did get to see it, right? The same's true for us, for our communities, right? If the Roman Empire of St. Paul's day wasn't too far gone, the United States in our day is not too far gone. That everything can't change if we're faithful about all the little things we need to do every day in the church and with each other and in our families. So that's the overview. Sorry I had to kind of rush there at the end.